Thy success in this enterprise, my sable friend, even though thou hast brought thy hound's sagacity to back thine own, will not, I fear, place thee high in the rank of wizards, or much augment thy merits towards our person." The Nubian answered, as usual, only by a lowly obeisance. Meantime, the troops of the Marquis of Montserrat next passed in order before the King of England. That powerful and wily baron, to make the greater display of his forces, had divided them into two bodies. At the head of the first, consisting of his vassals and followers, and levied from his Syrian possessions, came his brother Enguerrand, and he himself followed, leading on a gallant band of 1,200 Stradiots, a kind of light cavalry raised by the Venetians in the Dalmatian possessions, and of which they had entrusted to the command of the Marquis, with whom the Republic had many bonds of connection. The Stradiots were clothed in a fashion partly European, but partaking chiefly of the Eastern fashion. They wore, indeed, short hauberks, but had over them partly coloured tunics of rich stuffs, with large wide pantaloons and half boots. On their heads were straight upright caps, similar to those of the Greeks, and they carried small round targets, bows and arrows, scimitars and poniards. They were mounted on horses carefully selected, and well maintained at the expense of the state of Venice. Their saddles and appointments resembled those of the Turks, and they rode in the same manner, with short stirrups and upon a high seat. These troops were of great use in skirmishing with the Arabs, though unable to engage in close combat like the iron sheathed men at arms of Western and Northern Europe. Before this goodly band came Conrade, in the same garb with the Stradiots, but of such rich stuff that he seemed to blaze with gold and silver, and the milk white plume fastened in his cap by a clasp of diamonds seemed tall enough to sweep the clouds. The noble steed, which he reined, bounded and caracoled, and displayed his spirit and agility in a manner which might have troubled a less admirable horseman than the Marquis, who gracefully ruled him with the one hand, while the other displayed the baton, whose predominancy over the ranks which he led seemed equally absolute. Yet his authority over the Stradiots was more in show than in substance, for there paced behind him, on an ambling palfrey of soberest mood, a little old man, dressed entirely in black, without beard or moustaches, and having an appearance altogether mean and insignificant when compared with the blaze of splendour around him. But this mean looking old man was one of those deputies whom the Venetian government sent into camps to overlook the conduct of the generals to whom the leading was consigned, and maintain that jealous system of espial and control which had long distinguished the policy of the Republic. Conrade, who, by cultivating Richard's humour, had attained a certain degree of favour with him, no sooner was come within his ken than the King of England descended a step or two to meet him, exclaiming at the same time, "Ha, Lord Marquis, thou at the head of the fleet of Stradiots, and thy black shadow attending thee as usual, whether the sun shines or not. May not one ask thee whether the rule of the troops remains with the shadow or the substance?" Conrade was commencing his reply with a smile, when Roswal, the noble hound, uttering a ferocious and savage yell, sprang forward. The Nubian, at the same time, slipped the leash, and the hound, rushing on, leapt upon Conrade's noble charger, and, seizing the Marquis by the throat, pulled him down from the saddle. The plumed rider lay rolling on the sand, and the frightened horse fled in wild career through the camp. "Thy hound hath pulled down the right quarry, I warrant him," said the King to the Nubian, "and I vow to Saint George he is a stag of 10 tines. Pluck the dog off, lest he throttle him." The Ethiopian accordingly, though not without difficulty, disengaged the dog from Conrade, and fastened him up, still highly excited, and struggling in the leash. Meanwhile many crowded to the spot, especially followers of Conrade and officers of the Stradiots, who, as they saw their leader lie gazing wildly on the sky, raised him up amid a tumultuary cry of Cut the slave and his hound to pieces!" But the voice of Richard, loud and sonorous, was heard clear above all other exclamations. "He dies the death who injures the hound. He hath but done his duty after the sagacity with which God and nature have endowed the brave animal. Stand forward for a false traitor, thou Conrade, Marquis of Montserrat. I impeach thee of treason." Several of the Syrian leaders had now come up, and Conrade, vexation and shame and confusion struggling with passion in his manner and voice, exclaimed, "What means this? With what am I charged? Why this base usage and these reproachful terms? Is this the League of Concord which England renewed but so lately?" "Are the princes of the Crusade turned hares or deers in the eyes of King Richard, that he should slip hounds on them?" said the sepulchral voice of the Grand Master of the Templars. "It must be some singular accident, some fatal mistake," said Philip of France, who rode up at the same moment. "Some deceit of the enemy," said the Archbishop of Tyre. "A stratagem of the Saracens," cried Henry of Champagne. "It were well to hang up the dog and put the slave to torture." "Let no man lay hand upon them," said Richard, "as he loves his own life. Conrade, stand forth, if thou darest, and deny the accusation with which this mute animal hath, in his noble instinct, brought against thee, of injury done to him, and foul scorn to England." "I never touched the banner," said Conrade hastily. "Thy words betray thee, Conrade," said Richard; "for how didst thou know, save from conscious guilt, that the question is concerning the banner?" "Hast thou not kept the camp in turmoil on that and no other score?" answered Conrade; "and dost thou impute to a prince and an ally a crime which, after all, was probably committed by some petty felon for the sake of the gold thread? Or wouldst thou now impeach a confederate on the credit of a dog?" By this time the alarm was becoming general, so that Philip of France interposed. "Princes and nobles," he said, "you speak in presence of those whose swords will soon be at the throats of each other if they hear their leaders in such terms together. In the name of Heaven, let us draw off each his own troops into their separate quarters, and ourselves meet an hour hence in the pavilion of council, to take some order in this new state of confusion." "Content," said King Richard, "though I should have liked to have interrogated the caitiff while his gay doublet was yet besmirched with sand. But the pleasure of France shall be ours in this matter." The leaders separated as was proposed, each prince placing himself at the head of his own forces, and then was heard on all sides the crying of war cries and the sounding of gathering notes upon bugles and trumpets, by which the different stragglers were summoned to their prince's banner, and the troops were shortly set in motion, each taking different routes through the camp to their own quarters. But, although any immediate act of violence was thus prevented, yet the accident which had taken place dwelt on every mind, and those foreigners who had that morning hailed Richard as the worthiest to lead their army, now resumed their prejudices against his pride and intolerance, while the English, conceiving the honour of their country connected with the quarrel, of which various reports had gone about, considered the natives of other countries jealous of the fame of England and her king, and disposed to undermine it by the meanest arts of intrigue. Many and various were the rumours spread upon the occasion, and there was one which averred that the Queen and her ladies had been much alarmed by the tumult, and that one of them had swooned. The council assembled at the appointed hour. Conrade had, in the meanwhile, laid aside his dishonoured dress, and with it the shame and confusion which, in spite of his talents and promptitude, had at first overwhelmed him, owing to the strangeness of the accident and the suddenness of the accusation. He was now robed like a prince, and entered the council chamber attended by the Archduke of Austria, the Grand Masters both of the Temple and of the Order of St. John, and several other potentates, who made a show of supporting him and defending his cause, chiefly perhaps from political motives, or because they themselves nourished a personal enmity against Richard. The appearance of union in favour of Conrade